go over observational learning and reinforcement. Before we move too far, let's do a brief review. So the first day of the week, we're going to cover observational learning, and then we're going to see how that's connected to reinforcement, and then we'll cover reinforcement in the second half. The first half of the semester, we spent a lot of time on all of those theories that tied into information processing theory, and that's really where we ended before we started working on our midterm project and our midterm manuscript. Just because we're going to cover these terms again, let me just give you a brief review. We talked about how environmental stimulus comes in. We pay attention to it either through social learning, learning styles, or multiple intelligences, types of knowledge, and that helps us get up through Bloom's taxonomy to the upper levels of learning, and what's our preferred teaching method. So we talked about experiential learning to cover that because mainly it's connected to some of these other theories, which we're about to cover. So we pay attention, and the more efficient we are at doing that, the easier it is to get it into short-term memory. If we get enough rehearsal with that information, we can encode it over into long-term memory. All of those terms I just mentioned, you're going to hear about again when we go over Bandura's model or mediational process. It's heavily influenced by information processing theory. You're going to hear environmental stimulus again, paying attention to information, rehearsal, and encoding. So we're going to talk about all of those elements. Now, we ended the first half of the semester with covering explicit knowledge versus implicit knowledge. And I told you that we've really done a good job covering the explicit side of knowledge. We've gone in depth of how to take that information in and be efficient at it. But we've also talked about the psychomotor side. It's the whole reason we have activities in the class, so we don't neglect this type of learning. So that procedural knowledge, hands-on, skill-based learning, it's the whole reason we have activities. Now, something we haven't covered in depth is the affective domain. How does behavior affect motivation, or motivation affect behavior? How does that influence learning? Where does emotion come in when it comes to learning? How is this connected to the behaviorist theories of conditioning? And that's all going to lead us into the connection between conditioning and observational learning. So let's look at that for just a second. We started the beginning of the semester with social learning theory, but more so from Vygotsky's point of view. So cooperative versus collaborative learning, the Socratic method of teaching. Now we're going to go into another popular researcher's theory, social learning theory, and see how it's influenced by information processing theory. So Bandura is one of the most popular researchers in SLT, that's social learning theory. And you can see the influence of information processing. Bandura just added one key component. So we have environmental information coming in. So he talks about stimulus. As long as you understand how you learn best, which was the first half of the semester for us, it helps you pay attention to it. So we see it there. Then, if we rehearse the information enough, so that's happening here in short-term memory, we can encode it. So we see rehearsal and encoding here. That's going to help us retain it. We need to be able to retain the information in long-term memory in order to retrieve it, and that's going to be reproduction. For us to replicate what we've observed, we need to be able to retrieve it. It needs to have enough rehearsal to get in there, but in order to reproduce it, we have to practice, right? We have to get correct practice to do it correctly, and we have to get the correct amount and type of feedback that we need in order to edit out any mistakes we may have made, or even to be encouraged to continue to replicate what we've observed. Feedback's important on that. Now, something that is not included in information processing, but Bandura added in to his mediational process of social learning theory, was motivation. And that's going to connect us to the second day of the week, and even conditioning, because we're going to talk about reward and reinforcement. How does reward help reinforce behaviors? And how does that affect, or how does motivation affect learning? Let's scroll down here. Let's just look at the two. So we have the behavioral model above. And so that would be people like Pavlov or Skinner, more in terms of classical conditioning versus operant conditioning. That's what we're referring to when we talk about behaviorist model. So they say stimulus comes in, but internal behavior can't be studied. They're saying it's a black box, can't do anything about it. And then you'll have a response behavior. But the cognitive model, and this is where Bandura comes in, and the mediational process says, yes, you have environmental stimulus come in, but we can look at the mediational process and kind of look at motivation and its impact on learning, and then we'll have an output behavior. So that's the difference between conditioning and Bandura's social learning model, more specifically, this mediational process. Let's go more in depth here. So we have environmental stimulus coming in. We have to pay attention to that. We have to rehearse it so we can get it encoded, so we can retain it in long-term memory. Once it's retained there, then we can reproduce it, but we need to practice it in order to keep it there and correctly perform it, and we need feedback. And then you have motivation, which is what is the reward system to replicate this behavior, and what's reinforcing it? How does reward reinforce that behavior? So that's the mediational process. Observational learning, which is what we were just talking about, an element of it being the mediational process, is heavily influenced by modeling, and modeling is connected to experiential learning. Observational learning is a form of experiential learning. So you'll notice that you have things that you can do independently, that you can just observe yourself and replicate. You don't need any help from others. There's going to be things that you can observe, but you may need help from a teacher and peer, and that's where the feedback, reward, and reinforcement comes in, is the teaching process. And then there's going to be things that you can't do yet. So you would have an experience, you would make an observation, you would reflect on that observation, you would make connections, conceptualize the information, meaning connecting major ideas, and then you would create your own hypothesis, and then you would have a new experience, and that cycle would start over. That's still involved in observational learning. But you have a model. You tend to be observing somebody. So the classic example, Bandura had an experiment where they had an individual punch on one of those Bobo dolls. It's the Bobo doll experiment. So it's an inflatable punching bag that rebounds. When you punch it, it pops back up. You've probably seen it at some point in time in your life. So they had an adult punch on that, and they had a child in another room watch that behavior on TV. And then the adult leaves the room, the door opens, the child sees the Bobo doll, and without any instruction from anyone, goes over and tries to replicate what they observed. That's modeling. They are modeling the behavior they observe. And in order for modeling to take place, you have to have a model. And that's where the adult came in. They were the model. That's true observational learning from the child's point of view. So that's all I'm going to cover right now on observational learning. What I want you to do for the activity is go back to the mediational process for the activity of the day. So this would be fire churn, fairly complicated activity. What are you focusing on from the environment? What are you having to rehearse in order to encode that information? Because some of these elements are familiar to you. What type of feedback would be important for you to correctly reproduce what you've seen from the instructor? And what's your motivation for doing this activity? Talk about all four elements when you make your video. What's important to pay attention to? What procedural knowledge did you have to rehearse in order to encode it? What helped you reproduce the skill? So what type of feedback was important from the instructor? Did you receive any feedback? Was it true just modeling? You just observed what you saw in class and there was no feedback involved in order to adequately practice the skill before you made your attempt at the ember? And what is motivation for you to complete this? Is it your grade? Is it some sort of external reward? Or is it internal? Are you super interested? Or is it a combination of the two? That's going to connect us to the second day of the week. So yes, we're already kind of talking about reinforcement, but it's one of these 4 elements. I want you to talk about all 4 elements in what you observed in class and how it helped you complete the activity in order to make an attempt at an ember. What did you pay attention to? What external stimulus? What helped you retain that through rehearsal and encoding to get it over into the long-term memory? How did feedback and practice play a role in the reproduction of this activity? And what was your motivation to do the activity? External reward or internal?